all for coming. I am offering these forums because I am at present working with a committee in the congregation trying to put together a grant application due the middle of next month that is offered by the Lilly Foundation for clergy sabbaticals. It's a grant program that has been in existence for some time. The rector that I worked for when I was an associate priest in Massachusetts got a Lilly grant for his sabbatical, and this is intended to financially support both clergy and congregations when somebody is away. But it's a pretty extensive application that asks that the priest and the congregation sort of think about a theme for how the priest and the people might use that sabbatical time. And for me, I really would love to use this sabbatical, generally speaking, to reconnect with my past, in some ways to continue to reconcile with pieces of my past for the sake of revitalizing my personhood and my priesthood. And generally speaking, the two primary focal points around the travel that I would like to take next year focus on time back in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt, reconnecting with my family there, introducing my family to my wife and my children, but also returning to South America, where I spent a very formational year serving as a missionary in Rio de Janeiro. And I want to use this presentation to tell you a little bit about why those two focal points are significant to me. So my life, my story begins with these two people here. My mother actually has Jewish roots. Her grandmother would have identified as Jewish. In fact, her grandmother, Tess Krager, I have found out in recent years, is listed on Tulane University's list of top 100 Jewish figures in New Orleans history. My great-grandmother owned a bookstore in and around Tulane University, and we have old black and white photos of Edith Stein and Gore Vidal visiting my great-grandmother's bookstore. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a traveling book salesman and came through New Orleans, and that's how he met my grandmother. My grandmother was not a practicing Jew, but she left New Orleans after she graduated Newcomb, the women's college at Tulane, because she felt that everybody in New Orleans discriminated against Jewish people, that she felt discriminated against. And she ultimately settled with my grandfather in New York City. My grandfather comes from Christian Scientists, and I think there also are some Episcopalians over there, but they didn't raise my mother and my aunt religiously in any way. My mother grew up primarily in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. She studied Egyptology when she was a student at Barnard College, and my grandmother instilled in her daughters a love of travel. They spent lots of time when she was an adolescent traveling all over the world, and eventually a trip was taken somewhere, I guess 1975, 1976, to Egypt. My mother was traveling. She was in her early 20s with her mother, her sister, and the American actress Amanda Plummer, who was a family friend. And they came into the train station in Luxor, where my Egyptian family are from. And my Egyptian family, their business is travel. My birth father, Muhammad, nicknamed Hamada, he was at that train station at the moment that they came in, and the tour guide didn't show up for my mother and their group. And as I have heard the story, that day a friend of my father's was trying to get him to go out that night, and he said, I don't have anybody to go out with. And then he saw my mother in the train station and said, what about that pretty woman right over there? And so my mother heard them talking in Arabic, and she asked what they were talking about and said, well, are you going to invite me? And he said, well, I'm asking you right now. And so a romance ensued, and my mother, as far as I can tell, told her parents, I'm staying here in Egypt and, connecting with this guy Hamada. So that began the beginnings of my story there. So my mother got married in Cairo, and that wedding was done entirely by my Egyptian family. None of her family were present, as I understand it, at this wedding. So to the left, the man to my mother's right, that is my grandfather, Abdurrahim. And over here to the right, to my father's left, is my grandmother, Sania. My mother told me that her greatest regret in not taking me to Egypt when I was a child was that my grandmother did not get to see me. Because my mother said that my grandmother, Sania, was a wonderful, loving, faithful Muslim woman. And my mother told me before she died that if there is a gene for faith, she believes I got it from Sania. And then my birth father, Hamada, is the oldest of 7 children. And so when my mother married into the family, most of my aunt and uncles were quite young. So I believe the kids in that picture are some of my aunts and uncles. So, yeah.
Was there controversy on your mom's side about the racial disparity?
Yeah, I don't know from the letters. So I have letters that my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, wrote to Egypt introducing himself to Abdurrahim, to my Egyptian grandfather. And in those typewritten letters, he acknowledges that this is maybe not ideal, but it's happening, so let's get to know one another, is effectively how those letters sound to me. So, my mother wrote many letters home while she was living in Egypt on that little fragile parchment paper, right? It's amazing. They're still in pretty great condition. So I have a folder full of handwritten letters, largely written by my mother, that she wrote as a 20-something in Egypt home to her mom and dad, to her sister, to her grandmother, that describe her life, her daily life in Egypt, things that were going on. They're quite personal. There's actually also a letter in the top of this file from my grandfather in New York, who at one point submitted a sample of these letters to the New Yorker, pitching them, that perhaps they'd be interested in sort of a letters from Luxor kind of thing. And the editor of the New Yorker, who it seems like knew my grandfather, wrote back saying that she's a wonderful writer and they're wonderful letters, but they were too personal at the time, that they weren't sure how they could make use of them in the New Yorker. So, but I have continued to be able to sort of ruminate on these letters as I have reflected on her life and mine and my origin story. So these are pictures of my mother. It's sort of a weird print to the right. That's the left is my mother sitting along the Nile and the right is her leading tours. Eventually, my mother found work leading tours, in the pyramids, because my mother was a polyglot. She spoke many languages. She was an Egyptology student, so it seems like my Egyptian grandfather pretty quickly came to realize that my mother could be a real moneymaker for them. And it gave her something to do, and gave her something other than sort of staying in the kitchen, which it seems like was the normal, expected place for a woman in Egypt, certainly at the time. Yeah. So that's me, when I was born, and it seems like in reading the letters that my mother wrote, and there's letters where she talks about being pregnant with me, throughout the year 1978, she and my father were thinking about giving it a try in America. And she'd write in these letters about being in the mood to just drop everything and go to America. And it seems like by early 1979, when she was pregnant with me, that both of them were game for giving America a try. And I have letters from my grandfather trying to sponsor my birth father to come here, and there are letters where they're talking about how to get them started, and trying to find my birth father gainful employment, which, as my grandfather said, will increase the chance that they'll want to stay, But as I said before we began, this to me, I've reflected on this so many times because it's such a critical moment in my life. I didn't have any say in, but it completely changed the trajectory of my life. Because I really believe, as my birth father's firstborn son, that had I been born in Cairo or Luxor, I would have stayed, there. And that one decision changed everything for me. I would not, have known the life that I have lived up to this point. And so to me, I would say my life experience speaks to the importance of context and culture to the religious life. That I think where you're born, where the environment that you are shaped by absolutely impacts, how you make sense of the world, how you make meaning, how you reflect on, our Creator and yourself as a created being. That certainly has been true as I think about, how I was brought into the world. Right. And that's, to me, I would not be here if it were not for faithful Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And so it's very hard for me. That has to shape how I understand the Christian tradition. That has to shape how I wrestle, particularly with passages that show up in the Gospel of John, that gospel more than the other three. There are moments where it can feel pretty narrow, and I will admit I wrestle with that given my own lived life experience, And I was named Adam as a compromise because of, it's recognizable in both languages. My grandfather, Abdurrahim, did get to see me once when he came to New York after I was born. And so and look at this, the skin tone here. I came out blonde-haired and blue-eyed. And so that's me on my grandfather's shoulders with my father behind me. Hamada, Adam, and Abdurrahim. Yeah. But pretty quickly after they moved to New York, not long after the marriage started to fall apart, my birth father is the epitome of the Mediterranean man, right? I mean, if you think about the sort of machismo and, your sort of stereotypes about what that looks like, that is my birth father, totally, and he's a night owl. He likes to go out. He likes to have a good time. And I was a newborn, and he was in a foreign country, and the marriage broke up, I think, before my first birthday. And he went back to Egypt after some moments of tension where I think he had wonderings about trying to come and grab me and take me with him to Egypt. And I, have evidence of my maternal grandfather standing at the door to make sure that didn't happen, And then for a while, my mother lived as a single parent. We lived with my grandparents on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. My mother was searching for a faith community to raise me in, and she happened upon the Church of the Holy Apostles in Manhattan, just down the street from General Seminary, which in some ways has similarities to this congregation, and that's where I was baptized. And I was baptized by the Reverend Randy Frew, who has just died, and I got to have lunch with him, years later. But he baptized me, and he officiated at the wedding of my mother and the man that I grew up calling my dad, Tom Shoemaker, a lapsed Irish Catholic from the suburbs of Chicago. And that's me helping to cut the cake at my grandparents' house in Manhattan. I was baptized Adam James Hagagi. That's what I was baptized. That's the name that was given to me at birth, Haggagi, which I'm told is like Smith in Egypt. It's a very common Egyptian last name. And then my birth father went back to Egypt, and he got married again. This is a picture of him with his second wife and my sister Yusra. So I am the oldest of 7, just like him. So I have 6 half-brothers and sisters. My birth father, Hamada, has had 3 girls. So he married once, and he had 3 girls. So still, I was the only boy, which I think made a big deal. And then he took a second wife and has had a girl and 2 boys. Third wife. Well, but I'm talking about not being divorced, but that he is still married to right now, right? Yeah. So I learned when I went to Egypt in 2020 that there was actually a moment that he was married to 3 women at the same time. He married a woman who he told me was half Egyptian, half Italian, but that didn't last very long. So he has 2 wives concurrently, but the children live with their mothers, and so he goes back and forth between the 2 houses. But my sister Yusra is closest to my age, so she is probably 40 at this point, 39, 40. And she has just I now have a niece. None of my siblings had children until Yusra had a little girl last year named Malika, which in Arabic means little queen. Yeah. So when I was small, Hamada, who would come to the United States on business, because he did business with American tourists, he would come to New York out of the blue. I will say there was a brief period of time when I was not able to see him as a child because he was imprisoned in Egypt for apparently killing a man in a bar fight. He was a boxer when he was young. He's shorter than me, but pretty classic Egyptian build. He's very stocky in his build. But he would eventually call out of the blue, call the house, and at that point we were living in Long Island, and I could feel the tension as a child. You know, he wouldn't allow an adoption to go through, and so I went by shoemaker and school records, even though my birth certificate said Hagagi. And then we'd meet in New York City for lunch, Hamada, my mother, and I, and the lunch would usually end with him saying, "When can Adam come to Egypt?" And my mother would say, "Not anytime soon," because the American State Department told my mother that they would advise not to take me to Egypt, because by virtue of being an Egyptian male's son, I could, and we've investigated this, I could claim Egyptian nationality very easily, and when I was a minor, the American State Department told my mother, if Adam sets foot in Egypt, there'd be very little that we could do if Adam's father said he's staying here. So my mother just would say no, and Hamada would leave, and that would be it. Hamada told me when I visited Egypt in 2020, we had lots of conversations over meals, that, he did have feelings as a young person about, like, this is crazy. I'm going to take my son and bring him back here. But he said his mother, Sania, said, never take a child from their mother. And she said, if he is your son, he will come back to you someday. Yeah. That's what my grandmother said. Yeah. So this is another picture of me. I had really big curly hair as a child. This is me in my Oshkosh B'gosh overalls, holding the hand of my maternal grandfather, who I was very, very close to, my mother's father, who lived until I was about 16. But I show you this picture because I grew up with a very conflicted sense of self. I understand as an adult why my mother made the decision she did, but there was never an attempt made to get me to appreciate the Arab side of myself. I was never exposed to Arab culture, to Middle Eastern people. There was never an attempt to try to teach me Arabic or anything like that. And so, if anything, I grew up in some ways with the same stereotypes and fears of the Arab world that many people in this country have. And I would say today that I eventually had sort of an internalized sense of racism against myself, right? Like anything that I didn't like about myself, beginning with my Semitic nose, I blamed on my Egyptian ancestry. That's I wish I could just be American, right? I had those feelings as a child. I think what I meant by that is I wish I could look more Anglo than I do. I wish that I just had two parents like everybody else, and I didn't have this where I felt like I was being pulled in different directions. So it was difficult and something that gave me feelings of tension and conflict as a child. And then, I got to college. I went to Boston University as an undergraduate, and my mother, after my sophomore year of college, got diagnosed with leukemia. And She was dying effectively the last 2 years I was an undergraduate at Boston University. And my senior year, my birth father, Hamada, came to visit me in Boston. And really, that was the first time in my life that he and I were alone together without somebody else supervising or chaperoning the conversations. And yet my mother was very sick with cancer at that time. And nothing was explicitly said, but I felt like I was getting the message from my mother and my dad, Tom Shoemaker, not to tell him anything about that. And so I didn't. We were visiting. We'd have dinners in Boston. We walked through downtown Boston. My mother was very, very sick. I didn't tell him a word about it. Yeah. And then my mom died, probably a month or two after that visit. And I just couldn't handle any of that. So my roommate, who was Jewish, my roommate almost all the way through college, I remember calling my roommate from Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, tears just streaming down my eyes, telling him that my mom was dead. And my roommate was like taking care of all these things. And I told him, somebody, if my father from Egypt calls, I don't want to know he called. I was like, delete the message, This was before cell phones. I was like, don't, delete the voicemail message. I was like, I didn't respond to, emails, things like that. It was just, I don't want to deal with it. And, obviously my birth father didn't know what was happening, but that began a several-year-long separation that I basically, and at any step along the way, it would have been very easy for him to just forget about me. And he told me, he had friends in Egypt. He said, just forget about it. Let Adam live his life, My birth father has 6 other children in Egypt. I clearly was being raised by other people and was an ocean away, but he never, sometimes years would elapse, but he always has tried to initiate contact again. It was a long time. I'll tell you about that. This is a picture of my father doing his pilgrimage to Mecca when he was a young man, and another picture of my grandmother, Sania. So about 13 months or so after my mother died, 9/11 happened. And I have to say, my mother loved New York City. She loved New York. And a part of me was like, well, she didn't have to see that, But I will say that when 9/11 happened, that was a profound moment for me as somebody who grew up in New York City, in and around New York, with Middle Eastern roots, seeing what happened to New York, the devastation, the loss of life, the chasm in that city. I mean, I can't go back to New York City. I mean, they can build whatever they want to build, but the Twin Towers aren't there. The skyline it's forever altered, And yet, after 9/11, I also saw how Middle Eastern Americans were being treated. And the reprisals, the unjust reprisals. I remember I was living in Boston at the time, Muslims and Middle Eastern people getting on the subway, having to carry American flags in their backpacks to try to say, hey, don't attack me, I'm American, And I remember thinking to myself, because I'm a mix of the two cultures, but have the Semitic features. I mean, to most Americans, I look more Jewish, then I look Arab. I didn't come out with the stereotypical menacing Arab, look that I think would make some Americans want to move away or something like that. But that was just, I could have come out looking more like that had I not legally changed my name. My name, Adam Hagagi, my name still to this day would pop up on every, passenger list for added inspection. And so this experience to me taught me a lot about the prejudice not only of skin color, but of, the sort of racial and regional stereotypes that we walk around with, and how much more complex things are, right? Like, no, I am Egyptian, I am Arab, I am Middle Eastern, but I don't look quite like that to people, so that allows me to be shielded from the treatment that other people who have the same background and happen to look darker were being treated with, And I will say this moment started to trigger more personal work for me that I started to do in therapy and with as I began to claim my vocation in the church. And then I got married, and somewhere in my late 20s, we hadn't connected for nearly 10 years. And then out of the blue, Courtney and I are like in a car heading to Atlanta, and I get a message. I didn't recognize the number, and it's Hamada. And I remember, Courtney remembers seeing me in the car, and I was like, how in the world did he even find me, at that point? And I remember, this is classic, this shows you the personality of my birth father. I remember when I finally called him back, I said, "How did you find me?" He said, "Baby, I can find you whenever I want to find you." In that phone conversation that I had with him, I told him that I was married, that my mother was dead, that I was an Episcopal priest. Yeah, all in that same conversation. Yeah. And then he told me about the additional, that he'd taken another wife. I had other brothers and sisters. It's taken a lot of open-mindedness on both sides to reconnect and to keep things going, because there's such a chasm and difference of culture and context and religion and language and way of life. But this is a younger picture of my father. My mother said this is a picture of Hamada pretending to study. Yeah. Just like, what? Totally blown away. And emotional, that no. Well, and Courtney and her mother really encouraged me to reconnect. Courtney's mother was abandoned by her father. Courtney's mother's father basically took her out to get ice cream and said, Daddy's got to go, and she never saw him again. Yeah. And so for Courtney's mother, the fact that my birth father kept trying to be in a relationship with me and kept trying to reach out and kept trying to connect was so meaningful. And in 2011, when I was in my early 30s, we decided to take a pilgrimage in Egypt. And Courtney's mother was going to come, and we were going to go. And I had finally agreed to go. And then the day we were going to get on the plane was January 25th, 2011, which was the day of the Egyptian uprising in Tahrir Square, So Hosni Mubarak took over Egypt just about when I was born, And when I finally decided it's time for me to go, his government collapses, and we were going to fly Air France into the country. Most American airlines shut down. Air France was still flying, but it seemed a little crazy to fly in when we were seeing pictures of people running to the airport, And had we come a couple days earlier, we could have been stuck there, during the whole thing. But my father agreed, even though that was putting off a dream he'd had for a long, long time. It wasn't the right time. So another 10 years elapses, and then in February of 2020, 2 weeks before COVID started. And I'm telling you, if COVID had prevented this trip, I would have started to feel like, fate is just telling me it's just not meant to be, But I was able to go finally. And I traveled with a friend, and it was an amazing experience where my father had set up private tours that I would be on during the day, and at night I would just go from one house to the other, meeting brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins who've heard about me for 40 years and who had never met me before, and who just welcomed me with open arms. An aunt that I met at one of these dinners, my Aunt Nahed, she came over and hugged me the way you hug something that's been lost for so long, and finally, and with tears in her eyes was looking at me, and they all shared stories of my mother when she was there. Some of my aunts got emotional. I have an uncle. All my uncles are named after the Islamic holy months. I have an uncle Ramadan, an uncle Muharram, an uncle Rabia, an uncle Shaban. My uncle Shaban, who was a doctor, died of cancer. And my aunts were like, oh my God, it's Shaban back from the dead. When they saw me, they're like, you're like the spitting image of him, As someone who'd been raised an only child, I've always wanted to connect. I have 6 brothers and sisters, and this is me with my 3 oldest sisters, Noor, Yusra, and Hind. We had a dinner, and the older ones had heard about me too, like most of their life, and it was really wonderful to get to spend time with them. And Yusra and I got to spend more time with one another. She took me out for coffee and lunch and stuff like that. But and most of them can speak English. My family in Egypt, I think it's pretty clear to say, are well-to-do Egyptians. Most of them, the kids have all been raised in British or American schools and speak pretty good English. This is me at my uncle Muharram's house. Muharram's the big man to my right in this picture. And this is me, all with relatives. I remember Muharram was talking to me about the Lakers, that he loves the Lakers and his house. But he would be smoking a cigarette, and he'd look at me and be like, Adam, you're here. That it just seemed like so amazing, that I was there. So this was after a big dinner that we had, and oh my gosh, we ate and ate. This was like the prodigal son returns. Every meal was just an enormous, and a delicacy in Egypt is pigeon. So that was, it tastes like chicken basically, But it sure looks like a pigeon. It sure does look like it, yeah. And then this is me with Yusra and my cousin Sohaila, who is just a really hilarious person, the night before I left Cairo to come back to the United States. So I really hope to have the opportunity to reconnect with them. My hope is to spend a good month in Egypt on this sabbatical. My wife and children would come for maybe 10 days of that, but I would stay on this time by myself to really be with them, And I'll just also note that I am an enormous sports fan, and something that has really helped me along with embracing my Middle Eastern sense of self has been the rise of Mohamed Salah, who is one of the best soccer players in the world, who plays for Liverpool in England. I discovered him when I was cheering for Egypt in the World Cup, not the last one, but the one before that when the U.S. didn't make it, and decided I wanted to keep following Salah, and so I have gotten all into Liverpool. And this really, to me, has lifted up the power of representation. You know, this is the first time in my life that I've ever seen an Egyptian elevated to such stature in the world. I would argue that he is probably, right now, the greatest ambassador for Islam in the world. Every time he scores a goal, he drops and prostrates. And there have been articles, documented cases of attacks against Muslims. Islamophobia has dropped in Liverpool, England, while Mohamed Salah has been playing football for Liverpool. So I do hope, after I am in Egypt, to travel to England to see Liverpool and Mohamed Salah play soccer. So that's also a part of, and Liverpool's schedule isn't out yet for 2024. So I don't know where in England I'm going to be, but it has to be where Liverpool is playing football. I hope to see a few games. So yeah. Yeah, right? Yeah. If you go to Liverpool games, there's invariably somebody who has an Egyptian flag, you know, there, and people with Salah. And there's a whole chant from Mohamed Salah that Liverpool fans do around him being the Egyptian king. That's what his nickname is. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So then I hope to go to South America, and I served as a young adult service corps missionary, which is a program for young Episcopalians in their 20s to serve in some other part of the Anglican Communion, and I was placed in Rio de Janeiro. I spent 1 month studying Portuguese in a language school for foreigners in Salvador, which is the colonial port city where the Portuguese would bring slaves into the country of Brazil. So the north of Brazil is the place with the highest concentration of Brazilians of African descent. Although Rio and São Paulo are full of people from the north who've come to those major cities for work. But the further south you go in Brazil, it's more European ancestry. And Brazil, everything is flipped from the way we think about it in the United States. So the north of Brazil, it's hotter, and life is slower, and it's a more sort of agrarian lifestyle. And in the south of Brazil, it's colder, and that's where the big cities are, and that's where people who are more Anglo ethnically are situated. But Rio is sort of the cultural capital of Brazil. It's one of the most naturally beautiful places I've ever seen in the world. It looks like God just carved it out of the earth. I mean, beaches and bays and mountains and just really stunning. I mean, the famous beaches of Copacabana and Ipanema and the Christ the Redeemer statue that hangs over the city. But Rio is also a very dangerous part of Brazil. There are many what the Brazilians call favelas, which is the Portuguese word for slum or shantytown. And the favelas are primarily in the hills. So when it gets to be nighttime, you can see the lights in the hills, and those are primarily all impoverished areas. I was placed in a favela ironically called the City of God, Cidade de Deus, and there is an Academy Award nominated film by that title that documents a particularly violent period in the life of the favela that I lived in. I was stationed at a small Anglican mission called the Anglican Church of Christ the King, and when I arrived in Brazil, I didn't speak a word of Portuguese, but I was dropped in an area where there was no option but to speak Portuguese every single day. And that really, to me, showed me the power that our brain has If you don't have any other option, right? If you have to, in order to eat, in order to interact, in order to do what you need to do, over time you will learn, and you will learn like a child. Like I used to say, everybody is my Portuguese teacher, because people would correct me, you just sort of learn as you go along. I taught English in this community, which helped me. They would teach me Portuguese and I would teach them English. And this is me with community members. When I have visited this community since I've been ordained. This was me on a visit in 2011, where I got to read the gospel and participate in the liturgy and visited with them. The woman sitting down in front of me, who has since died, Donna Dora, her family were very welcoming of me, and I spent a lot of time at their house when I was, and I lived in that community. I lived in a room behind the worship space, but in the hottest times of the year, in Brazil, the hottest time of the year is December, January, and February. In January, you're talking 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. I mean, really, really hot. So in the hottest time of the year, I actually would sleep on the floor of the worship space because it felt too hot to actually be in a bed, and with a fan blowing on me during that time. Christmas Eve, when I served in Brazil, I had Bermuda shorts and a T-shirt underneath my owl because it was so Christmas in Brazil, Christmas food is summer food, right? And that's sort of weird because they see our movies that all are about snow and stuff, but for them, Christmas is the hottest time of the year. This is me walking around the favela when I returned. That street effectively, in Portuguese, could be translated as the evangelist street, and the life in the favelas is the Brazilian woman who came to church. We were talking about it when I was told her I lived here. It's another world. It's another reality. Brazilians that I would meet in downtown Rio would tell me that they thought I was out of my mind to live in that community. Although Brazil is a hyper-religious community, it's the largest Catholic country in the world. Being a part of the church, I think, very much gave protection. But in these favelas, at least when I lived there, the drug traffickers were the law. The police didn't have that kind of reach, and the lead drug traffickers were in their 20s, right? I mean, they started as children, and then they're soldiers as their teens. But I mean, the life expectancy is not high there. But growing up in a favela like the City of God, you're so prejudiced against by other Brazilians that you're almost marginalized before you can even get started. And so for a lot of these young people, being a part of the drug traffickers, it gives them a chance to have some respect and a sense of value and money, even if they're only going to live for a short period of time. And I remember once some boys coming onto the grounds of the church and older people being very deferential to them because they knew that those boys were with the drug traffickers. Every night in that favela, what the Brazilians call tiroteiro, gunfire, I got very good at distinguishing the difference between a car backfiring, fireworks going off, or guns being shot. Christmas Eve in the favela, it was like the Wild West. They were shooting guns up in the air. You could hear it going all over the place. This is me in the kitchen of where I lived. This is basically where I had breakfast every morning when I was living there. And then when I came back to visit, there was a British missionary. I actually was serving under a British missionary when I was there. This man's named Nicholas Wheeler, who'd been doing a wonderful job. And this is me with some of the men from the community there. And also, I would say when I go to South America, I have kept up my relationships with the church in Brazil. I serve as a member of the bilateral commission between the Episcopal Church and the Episcopal Anglican Church of Brazil. And I'm probably the best Portuguese speaker on the American side of that commission. And I have developed a relationship with Bishop Mauricio Andrade, who is the Bishop of Brasilia, in the capital of Brazil. And so when I went back in 2011, I was in Brasilia for a visit, and this is me and him outside the cathedral of the Diocese of Brasilia. So, I think there's lots of mission ties and mission opportunities that, I would love to foster through that travel. And then, just to conclude, when I'm done with Egypt and England and South America, I am hoping next year to be away during Holy Week. And it is a pretty unique opportunity for a clergy person to not have to be working during that special time of year. And I would love to go to experience Holy Week in a very different context. And the Episcopal Church of St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco, which actually parishioners Brad Erickson and Brian Prothero were members at. Brad Erickson was actually senior warden of this church. This church has a reputation for being very experimental. Worship is in the round. It's hard to see in this picture, but they have images of like dancing saints. And the liturgy of the word and the liturgy of the table are in two different places, and they sort of ritually dance from one place to the other. I hope to experience Holy Week at St. Gregory's before I conclude my time away, and Brad is working it out so that I could stay with one of the founders of the community who still lives in San Francisco while I'm there. And then the hope would be to come home to Asheville, where we have a family home for some transition time, and then to rejoin St. Stephen's after that. So that is sort of why Egypt and Brazil are so significant for me, and sort of the arc of what I'm hoping to do as I'm going through this. But are there any questions or comments? Yep. Uh-huh.
Just have a question. Had your mother not come back to America to have you, and would have had you in Egypt, that marriage probably wouldn't survive. I don't want to speculate for you, but it sounds like cultures were whatever.
Well, I have no doubt that had I been born in Egypt and was raised in Egypt, and that marriage had broken up, I would have still stayed in Egypt. I don't think my mother would have succeeded under those circumstances in bringing me to the United States. I could be wrong, but I'd be surprised about that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Will your family be joining you for any part of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes. So the idea would be for my wife and children to be with me on the way to Egypt. This is not something that I did in the slide presentation. We hope to make a brief stop in Europe. This was really going to be my kids' first time away. And Europe feel like the Middle East. When you're in the Middle East, you're like, wow, this is very different from the United States. So sort of, and stop off briefly in Paris. My wife speaks fairly good French. She studied in France during college. And then we would go to Jerusalem for a week. We have a Lutheran pastor couple that we're friends with who are living in Jerusalem right now. And so we would stay with them and visit with them. And I've never been to the Holy Land, and see some of the sacred sites in Jerusalem, and then go to Egypt. And Courtney and the children would come with me for maybe 10 days of Egypt. And then they would need to go home. I mean, the kids can only miss so much school. And then I would stay in Egypt on my own. I would go to England on my own. And then the plan would be that Courtney and I, just the two of us, would go to South America. And that Courtney's sister and others would help watch the kids so that we would have an opportunity to do some traveling together. And I could, Courtney has heard so much about that time in South America, so that I could show Courtney, and I'm not sure, I'm not worried about anything happening, but I don't want to mess around taking my kids into the favela where I served. I mean, on a Sunday morning, it's fine. You just get out of the bus and move expeditiously into the church. But she could come. And then, I didn't say that in this presentation, one city in South America, I did get to travel around South America some, and one city I really enjoyed outside of Brazil was Buenos Aires. In many respects, I found Buenos Aires to sort of feel like the Paris of South America. The tango bars and the big boulevards and the sort of the Eva Perón passion is certainly there. You can feel it. So we would be in Brazil for about 8 days and then fly on to Buenos Aires for a week before she would go home and I would go to San Francisco for this Holy Week experience. Right. Somebody who was at the forum that I did online emailed me and said they thought it was funny, as such a big soccer fan, that the soccer I want to watch is in England and not in South America. But a lot of the great South American players play in England. And I do think most people today would acknowledge that the English Premier League is probably the best, the most competitive league in the world, as it is today. Yeah.
But not because of the English soccer players, but because of the international.
Well, there's some good English soccer players. Yeah, there's some pretty good English soccer players. England still should feel optimistic about their chances in the next World Cup because they've got quite a generation of soccer players right now. This English team should win the European Championships of the World Cup, or it would really, I feel like, be a waste of the talent that they have right now on their team. Yeah. Yep.
I can kind of see some alignment with your doctoral thesis of kind of understanding the changes of this church and how
Yeah.
the change in your own life, and maybe also just reading something that I know the Episcopal Church bishops are thinking about it, and other kind of conversations about kind of white Jesus versus a Jesus of the world. And
Yep.
I think that really you've had that experience in what I mean, I imagine right, Jesus has kind of been a hard one in some ways. Has been your
Yeah.
with, and that
Yeah.
bringing that I think would be a really nice understanding for St. Stephen's, because we can't really, I don't want us to be very new, but I wouldn't want this to be a place of one take of Jesus.
Well, and that's a wonderful segue for me to also note that, again, where I began, Lily wants, in this application, for there to be a sense of how is the congregation going to use this sabbatical time? What might the congregation do in this moment where the rector steps away for a few months' time? And so there's monies that can be applied for both the clergy and the congregation. And I do think that, we celebrated our bicentennial last year, but I do think there's some strands from that bicentennial time and some ideas that came to the fore that maybe a year later could be explored further. So some things that we have thought about setting up while I am away. The Historic Charleston Foundation are willing to do oral history interviews, like where members of our congregation could tell their story of St. Stephen's. We could engage, and actually I have a historian now who's maybe interested in doing this, a local historian who could begin to help us update and write a fulsome history of the congregation. Marty has had the idea of we could invite some local rabbis and imams to do some adult education, talking about the monotheistic faith traditions. And also, right now we're doing some where the ministerial staff are sharing their stories. But it could also be an opportunity where some members of our congregation could do some story sharing as well to sort of help St. Stephen's continue to reflect on the rich, diverse history of this congregation as we move forward. And by the time I take this sabbatical, if I take it where I'm hoping to take it, I'll have been your rector for nearly 7 years, which is pretty hard to believe, but it is sort of an interesting moment to, with all we've done together in this season to reflect and then, go forward from that. But effectively, the other thing I want to say is I kept a travel blog when I was in Egypt in 2020. I think the idea would be that I would re-engage with that blog, and I would try to continue to write updates. The rector I worked for that took his sabbatical in Massachusetts, he did this. So the congregation could in some ways follow along while I'm away to learn about what I'm doing and where I am. But when I come back, we would also have some kind of a parish lunch, a parish gathering, where and I'm sure I would probably have a series of forums where I could talk about my experiences, but the parish also could share what they learned or what about themselves, about the congregation when I come back. So when I did this forum online, somebody seeing the Muhammad Salah thing said he'd love for me to do forums when I got back on the spirituality of sport, and which I do have a lot to say about that one, actually. Yeah. So.
Another idea I had is that, when this church was formed, pregnant women who were unmarried were welcome to the church. And so there were single mothers. And actually it was LaShawn Watson who said, she wished there were a ministry in our church to single parents, because we have several and they have a struggle that's unlike those of us who are married. And so whether we had someone present at an adult education, or we had a series of readings like we've done a couple times, or develop a support group here for single parents. I think that would be really a wonderful thing.
Yep.
That, we could invite people outside the congregation.
Right. Yeah, and I think the point of this sabbatical time is for the renewal of ministry. And let me also just say, I acknowledge this in the Zoom call, some churches can get spooked about rector sabbaticals, and some people can cynically look at a rector sabbatical as an opportunity for the rector to update his or her resume while they're away. The point of this sabbatical is to renew the mutual ministry between the priest and the congregation for another season beyond. That's what the terms are. And I will also say, Lily and the Episcopal Diocese, you can't do that. I can't take this grant money and then come back to St. Stephen's and say, oh, guess what? I took another job and I'm leaving. So I'll come back and hopefully we'll have another good, fruitful season of ministry together. So, yeah. Thank you very much for listening and taking the time. Yeah.